Almost 50 years ago, when ad executives on Madison Avenue came up with the slogan, "You've come a long way, baby," women's lib was just coming into mainstream culture. And in terms of impact, it was just getting started. A new 4-part documentary series, Her Story, The Female Revolution, charts women's progress over the past half-century, from politics to the workplace. And we're pleased to welcome two of the people responsible for it to our program tonight. In London, UK, Rachel Pashley, Group Planning Head at J. Walter Thompson, London, and the creative head behind the series, and James Rogan, the series director for Her Story. And it's great to meet you two, even if only virtually, here on TVO tonight. Rachel, let's start with you. What inspired you to get behind this series and want to make it?
I think one of the key things that inspired us was from the research that we were doing, questioning women around the world. We have a global study. A key thing that stood out was women felt they'd been airbrushed out of history. We weren't seeing enough female role models, and they weren't seeing enough female figures inspiring them growing up. So they felt that their achievements were largely unheard of, and we felt as an agency creating images in popular culture, there was something we could do to change that.
Well, I take your point because actually the word history is his story. And I actually kind of thought that the name of your documentary was going to be Her Story, as if to tell the other side of the story. How well do you think you've been able to tell that other side of the story?
I mean, it's a huge story to tell, because once you start delving into women's achievements, certainly in contemporary history, women are doing amazing, incredible things. So we had no shortage of material. I think one of the challenges was condensing it into 4 episodes. But I think what we have done is to create a narrative that really projects the idea that female progress isn't just the province of rich Western white women, it's a global phenomenon, and women from all walks of life are really working towards changing the world for the better.
James, 4 episodes, but literally shot all over the world. What was the logistical headache like for you trying to achieve that?
Well, we shot on almost every continent, and that was one of the exciting parts of the series. Logistically, that meant that it was a continent a week for me for a while, so I'd be back on the weekend and off to another continent. Finding the characters was very, very challenging because we wanted a range. Obviously, we featured a lot of female leaders, and they're quite easy to find in the media, but we also wanted grassroots leaders. We wanted people experiencing life, you know, in rural Niger or in Iran. So it was quite a challenge finding the people, and then once we found them, communicating with them. But on the whole, it actually came off relatively seamlessly, I think.
Well, we'll find out right after this program is over, because your first episode is going to air tonight and every successive Thursday here in the month of January. The first episode is about power, and I want you, James, to tell me who you thought was the most memorable of the female political leaders that you interviewed.
Well, they were all memorable. And it was an incredible privilege to get to interview those women. I mean, they were very, very impressive women. I think perhaps my most memorable experience was filming with the president of Lithuania, Dalia Grybauskaitė, because here was a woman who's really at the fault line of Russia and Europe. You know, we've heard a lot recently about the tensions between Russia and the West, and Dalia is one of the most outspoken critics of Putin. So it was incredible to actually interview her. She's got quite a fearsome reputation. No doubt anyone who stands up to Putin must do. But I found that she had a really, interesting sense of humor. She was very, very warm. She was actually completely disarming in the way she approached the interview, and I genuinely enjoyed meeting her.
Let's take a pause for a moment in our conversation to watch a snippet from your documentary series. And here is the president of Lithuania. Sheldon, roll it, please.
It was a very strange situation. Then he had a large amount of papers, which he tried to read me what Lithuania needs to do just the list of points, you know. You need to do that, that, that. You don't need to go independently, energetically. You need to work with us. You need to do that, that. I said, sorry very much, but we're independent country and we can behave and be peaceful, and we are open and friendful only on the basis of mutual understanding, mutual support and respect.
I remember Mikhail Khodorkovsky made a joke, so I'm on friendly terms with Russian dissidents, and he made a joke saying that, look, I deeply believe that Putin is really scared by women. He's scared by Merkel and your president, Grybauskaitė. If, he says, Hillary Clinton comes, then it would be the worst kind of nightmare for Putin.
Okay, now you shot that interview with her before the American election, so you didn't know when you interviewed Hillary, obviously, that she was not going to become the president of the United States. And I wonder whether any of the hopefulness that you experienced in that interview with her is somehow damaged now, Rachel, because she didn't win.
I think there are still very many women in positions of leadership around the world. So we have a female president in Lithuania, of Estonia, in South Korea, arguably for how much longer we don't know. So she's not the only female figurehead in the political corridors of power. And yes, obviously, it's very disappointing. But I think even the fact that she was nominated as the Democratic nominee marks incredible progress, actually, in the world. So I certainly would hope that she's not the only shot at having a female president in the USA.
James, you focused on Margot Wallström, who is the foreign minister of Sweden. Talk to us about how her gender led to a diplomatic issue.
So Margot Wallström, when she came into power, she decided that she wanted to enact something called feminist foreign policy. And that caused a lot of a big stir, and people were asking, what is feminist foreign policy? And it meant when Sweden came to renegotiate an arms agreement with, it was an arms cooperation agreement, it wasn't specifically an agreement with Saudi Arabia, there was a lot of pressure on the Swedish government to show what feminist foreign policy meant. Margot Wallström tweeted a critical tweet of the Saudi regime, and the Saudi regime responded very aggressively, withdrawing their ambassador, stopping visas for Swedish businessmen and women, I assume, and as a result, it showed just how sensitive Saudi Arabia was to the idea of being criticized by a feminist foreign minister. Margot's European colleagues were remarkably silent during this whole process, but it really did mark a very small but significant watershed that actually Saudi Arabia could be criticized by a foreign minister, and it could be held accountable in public for its human rights record, and specifically the way that it treated women. No matter how diplomatically Margot tried to do it, it ended up being quite a big story.
Rachel, I will acknowledge, even before asking this next question, that there will probably feel like a double standard inherent in the asking of the question, but I'm going to try it anyway, since it is a fact that there are very few, relatively speaking, female women in leadership positions in politics in the world today. So with all of that said, let me ask you if you noticed any particular set of qualities that you thought the women that you chronicle in your documentary series all had in common.
That's a good question. I think one of the things that we observe from the work that we do in research amongst women, but also in creating the series, was that women, when they lead, they think about legacy, and they also think outwards more. So when you look at, say, for example, female mayors in rural areas, they think about the community, and often you get, say, drinking water and sanitation projects enacted much more quickly. So I think they have an eye to the longer term vision and how they can improve lives for the communities around them. And I think that's something that really marks out women as leaders. I think perhaps, maybe it's a cliche, but they feel less ego driven in terms of their leadership style.
Well, Rachel, let me follow up with this, because Christine Lagarde, who heads the IMF, did say in the piece that you ran with her that she thought female leadership was, quote, more inclusive, but also risk averse. And I wonder if men, in your experience, recognize that as leadership.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, in that women are seen as more risk averse, and they're often seen as for example, a safe pair of hands, which is why, for example, there are so many women leading banks in India. So over 40% of India's assets are controlled by banks run by women. And I think that's one of the qualities that make us great leaders, not average leaders, but yes, risk aversion or making calculated risks can be the hallmark of great leadership.
Now, James, I take no joy in asking this next question, but I think it has to be asked. Christine Lagarde found herself in trouble in the French courts recently. There have been other female leaders as well who have got to the top of the mountain and then found it very difficult to stay there. We have seen impeachment in Latin America. We have seen other women get into trouble. The president of South Korea is in a heap of trouble right now dealing with impeachment. I'm actually not sure what the question is here, other than for those who thought being a woman in a position of political leadership meant you could avoid a lot of the trouble that men got themselves into. Does that appear not to be the case?
Well, it's very interesting. When we started filming, by the time we'd finished, all the women politicians that we had filmed with had some scandal or another directed at them, and that was an interesting pattern. I spoke to Joyce Banda, the former president of Malawi, and she said, look at the pattern, and then look at what they're actually charged with. Look at the scandal. And when you look at the scandals case by case, it's hard not to find that they're inflated. We've seen Hillary in her email server recently, given equal time to Donald Trump openly admitting that about the way he interacts with women, which many people found offensive. So we looked at the research, and there is actually research on the parliamentary expenses scandal in the UK that was particularly relevant to the series, which was that in the parliamentary scandal where UK MPs were charged with corruption, women had twice the amount of words devoted to their mishandling of their expenses as their male colleagues in the media. So there is actually now an increasing body of research which suggests women are actively held to a double standard by the media. And I mean, throughout all the cases we looked at, there was evidence of the double standard. Doesn't mean that they didn't do anything wrong, but it just means that they're held to a much higher standard of accountability.
Now, it is an interesting observation, Rachel, because Christine Lagarde, although she was found guilty of financial negligence from the time when she was finance minister in France, no punishment, no fine, not going to jail, she's going to get to keep her job. Does it make you pause and wonder whether or not these women are being targeted precisely because they've managed to achieve so much?
I think, to James's previous point, women are held to an incredibly high standard. And there's the adage that women are hired on proof and men are hired on potential. And I think that's very, very true. And there's also research that suggests when women are put in a position of leadership in a field not normally associated with their gender, if they make a mistake, the punishment, in effect, or the consequences are far more severe. And I think that holds true. I think we're seen almost as a risk in terms of proving our credentials, and therefore we have to prove ourselves much more. But equally, if we make a mistake, we fall from a much greater height. So I think that is a characteristic of one of the perils of being a woman, climbing the ladder of leadership.
Well, let me pick up on that metaphor of the ladder, because, James, I think it was the former American Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, the first woman to have that job, who said there's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women. And you do refer to women who don't create the ladder for other women. Embellish on that if you would.
Well, the first generation of women leaders, most famously Margaret Thatcher, were criticised because they didn't provide opportunities for other women to come into politics. Thatcher famously only had one woman in her cabinet throughout her tenure, one woman in two different roles. That was 11 years that she was in power. So there was a suggestion that she could have done more. And I think one of the interesting things about Hillary was that she took that Madeleine Albright quote and kind of ran with it. And I think that Hillary, Dalia Grybauskaite, Michelle Bachelet, Margot Wallström, they all speak to each other. They all know each other. They know that they have to support each other because they're doing something that really is changing the course of politics in terms of representation of women in major leadership roles. So I think that culture has shifted, and I think that it will continue to shift.
Rachel, whose story was most touching to you personally?
I would say, I'm a huge admirer of Dalia for her modesty, but also her courage. But I have to say that seeing Layla Sedek, the Iranian racing driver, who has been so courageous despite death threats and real challenges, to hold her head up high and continue to compete, but also to inspire other generations of younger women to follow in her footsteps. You know, whenever I watch her, I'm deeply moved, because she really is risking a lot to pursue something that she's passionate about, and not to let her gender hold her back. And I think that's hugely inspiring.
James, how about for you?
Well, I have a special episode 3 for me. The episode about religion was particularly important, and the struggles of the women within it particularly moving. I think we often talk about women in political power. We often talk about whether there should be more women in the boardroom, but it's marked by its absence from the conversation that we don't talk about women's power within religion. And religion really is, as I discovered through following the stories of a woman Catholic bishop who'd been excommunicated, a Jewish woman fighting for her right for equal prayer space at the Wailing Wall, that actually there are a lot of women in religion who want religion to modernize. They don't want to change their religion. They don't want to abandon the spirituality of their religion. But what they want is an acknowledgement that the patriarchy doesn't have to be quite as intense as it is. So I found it very, very moving filming with them, and I'm particularly proud of that film.
And James, let's just finish off on this. Of all the stories that you told over the course of the 4 parts in this documentary series, which of the challenges that women face in the world today do you think we need to shine the light on the most?
Well, I think that there needs to be a bigger conversation around the role of religion and the way that it interacts with women. And I think that we need to not be naive about it and reduce that. Often Islam, especially in the West, is spoken about in terms of women. But really Catholicism, Hinduism, any form of Christianity, Buddhism, all the major religions need to kind of take a long, hard look at themselves and say, are we really doing our best by women? And there was a very interesting interview that we had with Karen Armstrong, who talked about the golden rule, which is treat others as you would treat you would want to be treated yourself, which is at the heart of all these major religions. And she says that all these religions fail on that basis in the treatment of women. And I think that if that one thing could be truly addressed, I think that the huge change would come about as a result.
Wonderful. Well, I, for one, can't wait to see part 1, which will air immediately following this interview tonight on TVO. And for the next 3 successive Thursdays coming up in this month of January, we're going to continue to tell her story, the female revolution. Rachel Pashley, James Rogan, we thank you so much for doing the documentary series. And Rachel, to you in particular for struggling through with a nasty earpiece on this interview. Good for you. And we very much look forward to watching this documentary series. All the best, you two.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.